Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, Steve Price. Yes, you're right there. Erin filling in for Peter Credlin. Should be back with you on Monday. Now, here's what's coming up on Credlin tonight. The Israeli Defence Force now says it has Gaza City surrounded on all sides as the conflict enters a new phase, with the battle continuing to be a problem internally, I think, for Labor. They are split and all over the place on the Israeli response and the Palestinian death toll. Michael Shoebridge, Director of Strategic Analysis, will join us to tell us where this goes next. Also tonight, accused of murder and now formally charged and remanded in custody, Erin Patterson was in court today in Victoria over the mushroom poisoning case that's gone global. Our reporter Georgia Simpson was in the Morwell court. We'll have all the latest for you on what's happened there today. And more on this in a moment, but the realisation, I think, finally, that net zero targets in this country, agreed to by the former Scott Morrison government and embraced by the Albanese government and taken to an election, are going to be impossible to reach because massive damage will be caused to regional Australia. Shadow Environment spokesman Jonathan Dunham will weigh in on that subject. And the crazy Greens, speaking of Greens in Victoria, refusing to back the Labor government's tax changes to housing unless, wait for it, they include laws to freeze rents, taking control away from landlords. The Victorian opposition will have a view on that, I am sure. But first, though, as I mentioned, the realisation has finally landed in Canberra in the lap of everybody that Labor's ambitious ambition to have Australia powered by 82% renewables in just 6 years is simply a crazy pipe dream. It's never going to happen. It is impossible to reach, and it was never going to be achievable. So you have to ask the question, what now? Well, if you're the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and he did this yesterday, you deliver a speech that should have every Australian taxpayer watching me tonight and every Australian business screaming from the rooftops. Jim Chalmers actually made the point, quote, Australia could not achieve its net zero emissions targets without more robust intervention from government. Well, here we go, folks. And of course, the usual suspects seized on that comment and started putting their hands out, or at least putting them out for vested interests. Chalmers went on to make the point that speeding up the approval process was the key issue to attract more investment in renewables. Now, if you want to read between the lines there, and you can see what's coming, federal and state Labor governments around the country are going to seize planning approvals, and they'll ride roughshod over local councils and pass laws that allow green energy companies to start carpet bombing farmland with solar panels, wind turbines, and of course those awful transmission towers to squirt this green power into the grid. We are, and I'm predicting this, we are about to see the biggest battle between Australian farmers and government that we've ever seen. This is going to make the old lock the gate movement look like a kindergarten tea party. Already transmission companies in southwest New South Wales and central Victoria are telling farmers, look, we want to work with you, but if need be, we'll get legal access to your paddocks to whack up turbines and build solar farms. The National Farmers Federation, they've already put together an ad campaign pointing out that feeding people from productive farmland is what they do best. Now, who would have thought feeding people from farms? After Jim Chalmers' speech, Tony Wood, who's described as an energy expert, urged the Prime Minister, wait for this, to establish a COVID-style national cabinet to oversee the net zero emission transition. Well, we know what the COVID cabinet and how that worked. Now, Premier's locking us all up, sacking unvaccinated workers, that's what we had in the past with COVID, and squirting taxpayers' money around like a fire hose. Now, if that's the model for the green revolution, let's hope no one of importance is listening to Mr. Wood. Then we had the CEO of a clean energy company, a bloke called Simon Corbell, making this incredible statement. Quote, there are a number of hurdles we need to overcome to attract more green investment, including the reform of environmental protection laws that are delaying projects. So a crowd making money, attracting investment into wind and solar, wants looser environment laws. Can no one see, including the delusional Greens, what this all means? Simply put, wind turbines and solar panels are so great, so important to get us to net zero that we need to throw out protection for things like trees, wildlife and personal property. Isn't this exactly the opposite to what the city-based Greenies have fought so strongly against when it comes to mining, leases or gas extraction? I mean, quote environment fears on fossil fuels, but throw those concerns out the window when it comes to renewables. This is climate change madness. Now, as Deputy Liberal leader Susan Lee said here on Sky last night, Labor is admitting they can't deliver their own energy program. Meanwhile, Australians continue to pay more and more on power bills, while ministers like Chalmers and Chris Bowen run around in increasingly frenzied circles as the realisation lands on the desk that they cannot deliver what they promised. Let's head to Canberra. Speaking of Canberra now for tonight's political headlines with Sky political reporter Joel Philp.
Good evening. The federal government will push for unimpeded free trade with China when the Prime Minister begins his 4-day visit to Shanghai and Beijing on Saturday. Anthony Albanese is expected to also raise other sensitive issues with Chinese President Xi Jinping, such as threats against Taiwan and detained Australian writer Yang Hengjun.
Front and centre, he has to know that Australians expect him to make the strongest possible representations to both the President and the Prime Minister about Dr Yang, who is being held in detention most unfairly.
Mr Albanese needs to go to China and demonstrate strength. He needs to be forthright about Australia's numerous concerns.
Xi Jinping is expected to directly appeal to Anthony Albanese for Australia's support in its application to the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership.
Our position on this has been consistent all along, which is that anyone seeking to join the CPTPP has to be able to demonstrate a commitment and a record of making and implementing and adhering to their promises when it comes to trade.
The Prime Minister will try to steer the conversation towards a further easing of the $2 billion of trade sanctions against Australia still in place. Government sources say the historic visit is likely to bring about some incremental progress in the long-running trade dispute. The Australian government will not be forced to repatriate a group of so-called ISIS brides and their children who are stuck in a refugee camp in Syria after a court ruling today. The group of 20 Australian children and 11 women were being aided by Save the Children Australia in proceedings at the Federal Court in Melbourne. Lawyers for the organisation argued the Australian government has a moral and legal obligation to bring the group home. But the Australian government argued local Syrian authorities had control over the women and children, therefore it couldn't be compelled to repatriate them. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has joined mourners to farewell Labor Party legend and former Governor-General Bill Hayden at a state funeral in Queensland today.
Some giants cast a shadow, but Bill Hayden wasn't one of them. With his quiet strength of character, this legend of the Labor movement shone the light that let us see the road ahead.
Among the dignitaries in attendance were Governor-General David Hurley and former Prime Minister Paul Keating, who gave his sympathies to Bill Hayden's family and says Australia owes him a debt for his life of service.
For a self-effacing person, not driven by egotism, Bill's re-establishment of federal Labor as a real and genuine force is without doubt the crowning achievement of his long public life. Without doubt, the crowning achievement.
Thanks, Joel. Well, they don't make politicians like Bill Hayden anymore, do they? It's been a huge week for news right around the country. Let's get to our panel tonight. First up, Pauline Hanson's One Nation Chief of Staff, James Ashby, and Radio 2GB host, my old mate, Luke Grant. James and Luke, welcome. We'll get on to the rise in anti-Semitism in a moment that has Jewish Australians terrified. I actually took a call last night from one of Australia's most prominent Jewish figures, which I don't think it's fair to name that person, but I can tell you they were absolutely rattled about what's going on. But James, first, you saw what I said there about renewables and these impossible targets that started off with the Morrison government and then were inherited by the Albanese government. Now we've got Mad Chris Bowen running around the country making all sorts of promises. And Jim Chalmers, he's clearly saying there, well, we're going to intervene more aggressively. How much of a worry do you reckon that is?
This is massive, and this is one of the reasons why our MLC in Victoria, Ricky Lee Tyrrell, has actually put legislation up to protect farmland against these renewable resources that want to take over perfect prime agricultural land. This is a serious issue, not just in Victoria, but right across the whole country. I've seen it as I did a trip from Queensland through New South Wales and into Victoria, where these issues are taking place. So unless somebody stands up and protects farmers' rights, like One Nation, nobody else is going to do it. And at this point, Steve, that means this Labor government have committed $1.5 trillion to fast-track this renewable energy pledge, because that's the prediction of money that needs to be injected. Now, I don't know about those people sitting at home, but we're approaching $1 trillion worth of debt as a country right now. Think about 2.5 times that debt. You're paying for it, I'm paying for it, and that means your taxes have got to go up. So if we're going to put this on steroids, so to speak, look out. Pay for it in the long run, or we're going to go through some massive blackouts.
Luke Grant, when you pick apart that speech that Chalmers gave yesterday and he talks about greater intervention, I mean, you've done enough miles on Talkback Radio to know that the community really do rely on local government largely to look after planning, and they know they can go and complain if there's an issue. That read to me like the federal government with their state Labor mates as premiers are going to intervene in the planning process, and they're going to say to farmers, well, bad luck, mate, we're going to stick 500 hectares of solar panels there or 25 of these wind turbines on your property, and you can't do anything about it.
It feels like it, Pricey. Good to see you again, mate. You know, there's almost something maniacal about the response. I mean, just bear with me here, but big picture politics, and it shouldn't be, but it is. So the government copped a massive beating at the hands of the referendum, at the hands of the Australian people. So they couldn't land that. Now, this is front and centre, what the government came to power with, what the Teals obviously backed. If they can't land this, as much as we don't vote out a first-term government, they are in all sorts. So I think your observations and I think our concerns are right, that they'll try and just go right over the top of everyone here. They'll spare no expense and they'll do everything they can to get this done. I think it's absolute madness. It's ridiculous. And to think back to what James was saying, we're going to sacrifice land from which we get food to land they're going to pollute with wind towers, and, mate, absolute madness. But I'm with you. I think they're going to go over the top, but I think it's very dangerous.
James, you're there in Yeppoon. I mean, we just saw some shots of wind turbines based offshore. There'll be an argument from some of these energy companies, and I know most of this investment's coming from overseas, that don't worry, we're going to stick them 20k offshore out in the ocean. Do we buy that argument? Are they any better to be placed out in the sea rather than on shore? Because I imagine if I look over your shoulder there at that coastline, that beautiful coastline, do you really want those wind turbines stuck out there behind you?
Well, I think you can tell there's plenty of wind here at Yeppoon, but the last thing locals want are wind turbines, whether it be out at sea on our Great Barrier Reef or whether it be on the hills here in Yeppoon. That's not what people want. And they're going to get some bloody big arguments. I see around Newcastle there, One Nation are one of the only few parties out there championing the cause of those people who are saying, no, we don't want this, from fishermen to environmentalists, to those people who love whales, to those people who love dolphins. They're all getting behind parties like ours who can see no sense in putting wind turbines out at sea. We can see investors already saying, no, this is not worth it. We're not getting the return on investment for this. They're not putting the money behind it. But you've got half-wits like Chris Bowen out there making these announcements. They are half-thought announcements only to make sure they tick the box on environmental credentials. It doesn't stack up, Steve. The Australian people are starting to see through all this huff and puff of this Labor government and the coalition who implemented net zero as well. Don't forget, they're partially to blame for this, but Labor, again, are putting our renewable situation on steroids, and it's going to cost every Australian.
Yeah, let's hope Peter Dutton's got the spine to say, OK, I'm going to change the coalition's position on this. I was in Europe recently and the British Prime Minister, he's just said, look, we can't do this. We're not going to do it. We're going to change our view on this. I want to turn to the rise in anti-Semitism. I mentioned that call I got last night, which was from a really rattled Jewish person who is just feeling it very badly. We had that incident, Luke, yesterday I think it was at Bondi Beach, where a couple of clowns went around tearing down posters of hostages that have been put up. But I note today, I mean, this is again in Sydney, that the North Sydney Council Rangers were out today. This is a story in the Sydney Morning Herald tonight online. The North Sydney Council Rangers are going around tearing down posters of Jewish hostages. The blokes out at Bondi were fined, as they should be. What the hell is North Sydney Council doing pulling those things down?
Well, wow, talk about not reading the room. Give me a break. Have they no memory even back to October 7? I mean, it's October 7. Don't you know what happened? I think it's disgusting, Steve. I really do. Look, I was, I'd say, privileged to live in Sydney, grow up in Sydney's east. I used to walk past Moriah College every day on the way to school, recognise people I knew. Half my mates at Scots College were Jewish. I don't understand the hatred. And there was a story yesterday, mate, where there are people going to Jewish schools in Sydney. They won't wear their uniform. What the hell have we become? I think it is madness, and I think it is so insensitive, and I think apart from the disgust I have for people who hold anti-Semitic views, it's about time government got busy here. Now, are they worried what it looks like in some of the other seats in Sydney? I mean, it's hard to conclude what drives this. It's absolutely appalling, and Australia has to wake up to itself here. We don't accept anti-Semitism. We don't accept any of this stuff. So come on, let's stand for what we're meant to believe in, for goodness sake.
Yeah, James, it's getting really bad. I've heard callers to Talkback Radio saying they're too afraid to wear the Star of David round their neck even. You've got this Teal MP, Monique Ryan, the independent MP for Melbourne. She holds the seat of Kooyong. For my fortunes, I managed to sit in front of her at the Paul McCartney concert the other night, which wasn't a lot of fun. She's been accused of unacceptable bias in expressing outrage for the deaths in Gaza, but not the deaths of Israelis. Now, she did respond late this afternoon saying she rejected the accusation and that it misrepresents her position. But James, I mean, she's got a large Jewish community in that seat. I think that this is really going to damage her, but she's got to read the room, as Luke said, as well, doesn't she?
Well, the Teals are a failed political experiment, Steve. Let's face it. Simon Holmes Accord should be out there saying to Monique himself, Monique, correct the record here because you've got this wrong. Where was she on October 7 when over 1,000 people were being slaughtered in Israel? Where was she? Was she having her cheese platter and great wine on the back deck and just didn't turn the telly on for a few days? I don't know, but Monique's got this really, really wrong. And, you know, when you have a look at the history will haunt her because 5,000 rockets that afternoon come over the border and were smashing indiscriminately into people's houses. Those Hamas Palestinian terrorists were throwing grenades into shelters where people were cowering for their safety and their life. And she's completely ignored this. She has misread the room. She doesn't understand the upset that she's caused. She will be the first Teal, I think, on election night, whether that be late 2024 or 25. She'll be the first Teal to go. And Simon Holmes Accord should be making a phone call to her and saying, get this right, because I backed you. I put $200 million into the Teals, and you're making a mockery of me as well. So, Simon Holmes Accord, time you speak up as well.
Yeah, well said, James. James Ashby and Luke Grant, thank you very much for your time tonight. Have a good weekend. Now, it's been a huge day news-wise in Victoria with Erin Patterson, of course, the woman allegedly at the centre of the poisonous mushroom meal that saw 3 people killed. She's appeared in the Latrobe Valley Magistrates Court. Now, our reporter, Georgia Simpson, was there today for the appearance, and Georgia joins me now. No application for bail, Georgia. Did that surprise everyone?
Well, Steve, the reason why no bail application was made is because the magistrate, Tim Walsh, down at the Magistrates Court in Latrobe, doesn't actually have power to grant bail. So for that to happen, her lawyer, Bill Doog, would need to make an application through the Supreme Court here in Melbourne. So Erin Patterson appeared in court today for the first time after spending her first night in jail. Today was just a filing hearing, so it was really brief, going through all the administrative processes. The next court date for her is May 3 next year. The reason why it is so far away is because police prosecutors asked for 20 weeks to analyse computer data from a computer that was seized during the police search yesterday of Erin Patterson's home. The magistrate appeared a little bit frustrated by this. He did query why, if they had enough evidence to charge her on Thursday, did they need such a lengthy period to analyse this data? But regardless, Erin's lawyer, Bill Dew, consented to this, so that's what's going ahead. There was a really brief exchange between Erin Patterson and her lawyer when she first entered the courtroom, more of a hi, how you going, I'm okay type situation. She kept her face to the magistrate for most of the hearing, but as she was leaving, she did steal a glance towards the media, and she would have seen a courtroom pretty much full of journalists from right across the state.
Georgia, good work. Thank you very much for that. Georgia Simpson, thank you very much for your time. Now, coming up after the break, the Prime Minister is again set to jet off out of the country. He's going to China. Can't criticise him for that. So what can we expect from the trip, and can we trust that national security is actually going to be number one priority in those conversations? Plus, as even Jim Chalmers admits, as I made the point earlier, the net zero target's looking shaky, while farmers are revolting at the imposition of renewable technology on prime agricultural land. We'll have more to say on that shortly. Welcome back. Great to be with you. Peter Credlin will be back with you on Monday. Now, as I mentioned, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, he's off to China this weekend. He'll be the first Australian Prime Minister to visit China since Malcolm Turnbull went there in 2016. It's funny how your memory plays tricks on you. I don't even remember Turnbull making that trip in 2016. Now, obviously, tensions between our two countries, they were at a peak during the COVID when Scott Morrison, the then Prime Minister, asked for an examination into what happened in that lab in Wuhan. It's certainly been welcome news for exporters, particularly exporters selling things like wine and crayfish and lobsters. Now, the PM will be pushing for even more restrictions, you would think, to be lifted. However, this cannot come at the expense of our national security, nor can Beijing's growing hostility and thinly veiled intentions be ignored. Now, he's just come from the United States, Anthony Albanese. It's going to be very interesting to see whether Xi Jinping asks him about that visit where he caught up with the US president. This comes, of course, as those tensions in the Middle East are just getting worse and worse. Joining me now to talk about all of this, the Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, Michael Shoebridge. Great to see you again. How fine a line does PM Albanese have to tread in Beijing when he gets there at the weekend?
Well, Steve, he's already paid an extremely high price to get this visit. So he's ended two winning World Trade Organization cases, one on barley and wine, the other on wine, like you mentioned, which would have formally established that China uses trade as a weapon. He's reversed his position on Darwin Port, leaving it in the hands of a Chinese operator. And the biggest price he's paid so far just to get to Beijing is silence on China's increasingly dangerous military encounters with our Australian military and everybody else in the region. So he's not really walking a tightrope. He's given a set of concessions for this handshake.
What have we got on this side of this bargaining chip? I mean, what can we say to the Chinese that they are going to want to hear? And conversely, Michael, what does China want from us?
Well, so far, we're the one that has given the concessions. And in return, Xi Jinping has released one of three Australian political hostages that he holds, Cheng Lei, leaving Yang Henjun and Charles Ng in detention in China. And he's temporarily allowed barley and wine sales back into China. Wine not yet, but that's in a riskier business environment. So really, Xi's getting everything he wants. The only other thing he can get is Mr. Albanese looking like a supplicant approaching the emperor.
Yeah, that's going to be very difficult for him because, I mean, if you wanted to raise things like, well, do you say to Xi, why are you supplying weapons to the Russians? Because obviously they've invaded Ukraine and we're on the side of Ukraine. I mean, what do you say to Xi about the aggression from Hamas, the terror attacks from Hamas? Do you say anything about that? Or diplomatically, do you just have to bite your tongue?
Well, Steve, I think we'll have some diplomatic kabuki dances where mentioning Hamas and mentioning Ukraine will be recorded as having been done. But Mr Albanese will have no expectations other than he's gone through the motions. But the problem is, with that slogan we hear so much of, cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, and engage in our national interests, the working model we're seeing from this government is they will concede wherever they can find a way and disagree only when backed into a corner with no way out, like continuing AUKUS and the alliance.
Yeah, and they've got themselves in all sorts of trouble also over, Gaza and Hamas and the Palestinian question, with the government split, depending on which minister you're listening to, about, the Palestinian death toll. What do you make of the latest out of the Middle East? The IDF today saying, Michael, well, we've got Gaza surrounded on three sides, fighting continuing on the inside of this. I mean, this is obviously the plan. Where do you see this going?
Well, I think Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has been crystal clear that this war is not going to stop before Hamas suffers much more damage and destruction. There might be the occasional brief humanitarian pause, but the Israeli will is very clear. Hamas has badly miscalculated. Hezbollah and Iran see that this is too much trouble to get involved in, and Hamas now realises they've brought down too much on themselves and the Palestinian people that they rule so brutally over.
How much do you fear involvement by Hezbollah out of Lebanon?
I think it's a remaining large risk, but the Israelis are keeping more forces on that northern border, and the Americans are standing right behind them, including with two powerful carrier battle groups. That's really making the Iranians and Hezbollah think again about doing too much.
Always a pleasure to catch up with you, Michael. Michael Shoebridge there. Let's turn our attention now back to a domestic issue that I know is keeping our farmers awake at night. I mentioned it at the beginning of the program. This is Labor's imposition of huge transmission lines and renewable projects right across prime agricultural land. I've written about this in the Herald Sun tonight, and it'll be up in the paper tomorrow. The number of wind turbines that I saw scattered throughout southern Italy when I was there a couple of weeks back is just staggering. Now, much of this seems a violation of property rights. You've now got the Labor Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, saying, well, we might have to intervene more strongly to make sure that we can get planning assistance for these projects to get up. You've got this Meadow Creek project in northeast Victoria, which might go ahead without the government considering soil and waterway protection. It's a huge project in a beautiful part of Victoria. Joining me to discuss this, the Shadow Minister for the Environment, Jonathan Duniam. Jonathan, good to talk to you again. What did you make of that Chalmers address yesterday? And when you pick it apart, do you, like me, think that's him saying, OK, we're going to have to override some planning issues here to get this stuff up and running?
I think that's spot on, Steve. I mean, the reality is this government have got some pretty ideologically backed goals that they're going to see through to completion, no matter what the cost. You only have to go and talk to farmers to understand how concerned they are about what is an impending David and Goliath battle, not only in Victoria, but you go to Chalumban in Queensland, and we've got various projects right across the country facing the same sort of future, and farmers very concerned about their ability to do business. And of course, the increased cost of produce getting passed on to the consumer. All of this could be resolved, at least to some degree, if Labor and the Greens stopped blocking our inquiry into these matters in the Senate. You know, we want to have a good look at what's actually going on here, but Labor and the Greens certainly don't want the world to know what they're up to.
Jonathan, there was a bit of a victory down in Tassie, your part of the world, during the week, with the local community managing to get a wind farm project cancelled, which they didn't want on that beautiful part of the northwest coast of Tassie. We have to take some heart out of that.
Well, look, I suppose community activism is an important part of all of this. We come from a renewable state down here in Tassie. We've got a lot of hydro and a bit of wind, not much solar because the sun doesn't shine that much here. But look, community have a very strong view about these projects, and particularly up the northwest, we've seen a lot of opposition to projects up there. There are places for these projects to occur, but to put all our eggs in one basket and not focus on the need for reliability and cheap power, I think is a complete mistake. And we're seeing more and more of this from state and federal governments across the country.
Well, I don't think average Australians yet have woken up. Farming groups have, and the National Farmers Federation now, Jonathan, are running a very strong campaign saying, look, what we do best is grow food. And if you're going to increase our population to the rate that the Albanese government is, with 500,000 immigrants coming into the country, then what we have to do is keep growing food and not turn prime agricultural land over to these massive projects. That one I mentioned up near Millawa in the northwest of Victoria, that's a 540 hectare solar farm on prime growing land. That's up in the King Valley, which is famous for its grape production. I mean, how closely do governments have to look at this stuff? And look, you could be in power after the next election. How close do you seriously believe we're going to be by 2030 to net zero?
Oh, look, I mean, and this back to Jim Chalmers for a point there. His speech about all of this, I thought it was interesting that he focused on the government not reaching its commitment on net zero by the appointed time in the future, but no reference at all to the cost of electricity, the promise they made to bring power prices down by $275 a year for each household. No reference to that at all. So it speaks volumes about their priorities and where they're focused at the moment. But in terms of government overreach and them pursuing these projects this way, I mean, seriously, we do need to look at what we're doing here. Turning prime ag land, when we do want to grow our population, as you say, into solar panel arrays or wind farms is, I think, a disaster. Much in the same way as shutting down our forestry industry is. When we're going to try and build 30,000 new homes, what are we going to build them out of? Concrete and steel? Because we're not going to be able to cut down trees to build timber frames for houses. This is the madness of these inner city, ideologically based policies that Labor, state and federal, are pursuing at the expense of economic activity in our regions and indeed our states too.
Yeah, spot on. And I mentioned that I had been in Europe recently. I mean, you drive through France. France has got 54 nuclear reactors powering France. And that's what they rely on mainly for their power. Yes, they've got some renewables, but they have a suite of things. Tassie's lucky enough to have your hydro, but you still do need gas. I mean, we need to use everything we've got, don't we? I mean, why would you give up as a country one of the great assets, which is we've got coal, we've got gas, we've got uranium for nuclear energy, we've got water, we've got sun, we've got wind. Why not use it all?
Spot on. It makes no sense to draw a big red line through one particular source of energy generation just because you've got an ideological opposition to it. And I keep using that word, ideology. It's not fact-based, it's not science-based, this opposition. The world's moved on from Chernobyl. Technology's improved. There isn't a country out there. If we go back to Jim Chalmers' holy grail of net zero at whatever the cost, there is no country out there with a credible pathway to net zero that doesn't have nuclear as part of the mix. What's more, there's no country out there that has a pathway to cheaper, more reliable power that doesn't have nuclear as part of the mix. So to rule it out, but put all our eggs in the renewable basket at the expense of everything else, I think is just, as I said before, absolute policy madness. It'll appease the Greens, it'll appease those who live in inner cities and don't care how much power costs, but it will not do anything for our economy and particularly for people in our regions, the backbone of our economy.
Well said, Jonathan. Good to catch up with you again. Jonathan Dunningham there. Now, after the break, the Victorian government, speaking of crazy governments, seems to only have one solution to balance the horrid budget, which is the worst budget deficit in the country, and that's to tax their way back to prosperity. I'll get all the details on their latest land tax, which you won't believe, up shortly. Welcome back. Now, I want to go to Victoria, where the Labor government under Jacinda Allen is pushing to expand existing vacant residential land taxes to include regional Victoria. In the past, it's just been the inner suburbs and the CBD. Now, under this plan, the new tax would be expanded on homes empty for at least 6 months a year in all of Victoria. So for anyone who's using their property for a holiday rental, which of course is going to be empty for a good period of time, particularly in Victoria in the winter perhaps, this is going to be a big cost and likely to push them to the brink. However, Labor's bill to do all of this is stalled in the upper house. Now, the Greens, as mad as they are, they want to have rent freezes. Now, no one's going to agree to that. The Greens are pushing for impositions on landowners of all sorts of things. But what else could you expect from a state government? Got the highest debt in the country, higher than New South Wales and Queensland combined. They're desperate for money, and their only way out seems to be taxing themselves or taxing us. Joining me now to discuss this is the Shadow Minister for Home Ownership and Housing Affordability, Evan Mulholland. Evan, welcome. I mean, you've gone through the numbers, you've talked to real estate agents, I presume. What's the impact of this going to be on the housing stock of Victoria?
It's going to be very bad, and about 1 in 4 property investors are getting out in Victoria, are fleeing the state or fleeing the market because it's no longer a certain investment. And you've got mum and dad investors that are being treated like a piggy bank for the government to pinch from. These are people on average on about $100,000 a year that have made that choice to invest for their retirement, that have made that investment decision, and the government's coming after them because they're broke.
The tax, I can't quite work out how this is actually going to work. So if I've got a property in Melbourne and then I've got a holiday house, say on the Mornington or the Bellarine Peninsula or down in Gippsland, and I usually rent it out over Christmas, that pays my costs largely, including the increased land tax that Dan Andrews imposed on everyone. How are they going to know whether I'm there or not there and who's in the property and who isn't? I mean, it's impractical to make this work, isn't it?
It's crazy, but they're going to do things like check your water bill.
What?
They're going to do creepy things like that in order to make sure someone's actually living there. But this just drives investment away from Victoria at a time where we can least afford it. We need our system, our state to work for investment. We need investment in our housing supply so we can drive down rental prices and housing prices as well.
Treasurer Palace says that, one of the reasons why he's decided to do this is that if there's vacant land and someone's sitting on it, land banking they call it, then that land should be developed because we need to build more houses. But I mean, we live in a free market, do we not?
And half the time it's the government itself that is stopping that development, whether it be local councils or state government or government bureaucracies like Melbourne Water holding things up. Another thing they want to do is tax undeveloped land. And when you've got developers with huge properties like built in 5 parts, that all can't be done at the same time because it's uneconomical. And usually the building materials and supplies are being sucked into the government's big build. So they're going to end up being taxed on the last 2 parts.
Like the rest of the country, I mean, Victoria's obviously got a housing crisis. Rental vacancy rates are down at 0.1%. And you've got a whole bunch of taxes that are layered on top of that now, including this land tax. You've got the Airbnb tax. Now you've got this. I mean, I hear investor after investor after investor ringing Talkback Radio and saying, well, my place is on the market. I'm going to go and invest on the central coast of New South Wales or in Queensland, where a mate of mine's got a property in Queensland. He pays no land tax.
Well, that's right, and the evidence backs that up. The Property Investment Professionals of Australia survey found that 1 in 4 investors are getting out in Victoria, and they put the reason down to higher property taxes. When you tax property, that makes it an uncertain investment, and people are clearly going to leave the state because the state's broke. Now, Treasurer Palace botched this from the start. He's adjourned this bill off. It didn't pass. He announced it at a property council breakfast. He announced new taxes. What's he going to do next? To announce a ban on duck hunting at a duck hunting conference?
Didn't even tell the Premier. Please give me confidence, Evan, that they're not going to cave into the Greens. We're not surely going to live in a state where the government says, OK, you own a 2-bedroom apartment in Albert Park, you're not allowed to put the rent up for 2 years.
the Greens' policies are insane. Their policy of a rent freeze for a party that bemoans Donald Trump-style populism, they are the most populist party there is. A rent freeze is supported by no economists. A rent freeze is bad news for all Victorians and will it'll only make the queues outside rental inspections even longer because it doesn't actually help people that are trying to get into the home ownership
they're not going to
market.
cave into the Greens.
Well, they've spoken very strongly against rental freezes, if I can give them an ounce of credit. But this is the thing. The government passes bills all the time with the support of the Greens, so I'm very concerned about that. And the opposition would call on the government in the strongest possible terms to just scrap the bill altogether.
And this is happening at the same time that in large parts of Melbourne's residential areas, the government's knocking down its own housing commission apartments. Where have those people gone?
Well, that's right. Well, that's what they want to do, and we're still waiting. We're still waiting for the detail on that. A lot of people in my electorate, in those commission houses, got consultation notices after the government had already announced. It's just you're seeing the signs of an almost decade-old government. They're tired, they're incompetent, they're corrupt, and they're making life harder for each and every Victorian.
Yeah, it's great to have you in here. Thank you very much. That's Evan Mulholland. Thank you very much for your time, mate.
Cheers.
Coming up after the break, thanks for that, Evan, and I think you're right, that Victorian government's certainly tired. Coming up after the break, the AGM, the annual general meeting for Qantas, was on today. There's a lot of angry shareholders there. We'll have a look at that. Plus, I'll get my panel's take on the self-entitled workers who are trying their damnedest to avoid going back to the office. Public servants who work for the ambulance service. Prue McSween and Tina McQueen will join me. Welcome back. Steve Price with you. Another tough day, a rough day for the Qantas board, the chairman in particular, Richard Goyder. The AGM was on today. It went as expected. Shareholders not holding back on the executive team. Now, shareholders delivered a resounding rejection of the company's remuneration report. 83% voted against it, so we'll see where that goes. And that comes, of course, as leaked internal document reveals that on all measures of brand trust, Qantas is now slumped behind Virgin, which I didn't think I'd ever say that ever. Joining me to discuss this and much more of what's been unfolding this week, Peter's Friday regulars. I call them the Power Panel. Sky News contributors Prue McSween and Tina McQueen. Great to see you both again.
Thanks.
Prue, can I start with you? You understand branding and brands. Pretty clear message from shareholders today. And when shareholders tell a publicly listed company they're not happy, they have to listen. What has Qantas got to do, do you think, to get itself back to where it should be?
Well, it's going to be its performance, Steve. They face a long haul in reversing this brand, distrust, because trust is everything in a brand. And sadly, they have proven that they couldn't be trusted on every scale that you look at it. So it will be time and performance because, frankly, words is cheap. And you can penalise them with this remuneration package, which was thankfully, voted down. But, the point is that brands forget about it. Look at all those woke companies that got behind The Voice. The arrogance of corporate Australia is, to be, really criticised across the board. And frankly, I think that Qantas is going to just have to perform a lot better because that's the only way. And it's going to be a long time before we go back to Qantas, I believe.
Well, Tina, it is interesting. I mean, and you fly a lot, I fly a lot. I know that Prue flies a lot as well. Every Qantas plane I get onto is full. So it's not about filling up seats because they're already full. But what about poor Vanessa Hudson, the new CEO? I mean, Alan Joyce really has handed her a poison chalice, hasn't he?
Oh, he sure has. But I think a lot of the problem was Alan Joyce, Steve. He wasn't liked, And if she does a decent job and starts to turn things around and Joyce is forgotten at some point, I think they'll start to perform better. To be honest, I've never had a problem with the Qantas, but I do understand what the shareholders did, what they did today.
$370,000 though, Tina. That was a lot of money to tip into the Yes campaign.
That was a big thing. That was the big thing that I took out of it, was that they were very upset that they, and look, I suspect it was a bit more than that, because they painted the planes and everything, Steve, but that really annoyed the shareholders. Learn that lesson, all corporate bodies. Be careful what you back next time.
Yeah, well, the banks did it as well. I think it'll be a while before we see major corporations jump on board something like they did with the Yes campaign. I want to turn our attention to Victoria. I couldn't believe this story this morning. So Ambulance Victoria, you think of the ambulance services in any state in the country, and, you know, if we ever need an ambulance, we want it to turn up on time. We love the people who work on the road for ambulance services right around the country. But there's a bunch of bureaucrats in Victoria. They do not want to actually go back to work. Now, these are public servants paid for by the taxpayers of Victoria. They're going to a workplace tribunal, can you believe it, to avoid having to go back into the office 3 days a week. They're not asking them to go back 5 days, just 3. I mean, honestly, Prue, this made me really angry today when you consider the real workers in the ambulance service are those men and women who are out there, you know, dragging broken bodies out of car wrecks at 2 o'clock in the morning, and these shiny-seated public servants think it's okay to work from home. I don't want to go back to the office, I'm not going to do it.
Well, it's outrageous, Steve. You know, you have to question whether, you know, public servants, I think, only work about 3 days a week, even if they pretend they're working 5, from what I can see with the performance of most of them. But, you know, it is outrageous, and I hope this government, I mean, you don't have much hope in or faith in the Victorian government anyway, but I just hope they stand up to them because, you know, it is ridiculous. We're paying them a fortune. I bet they're on really big fat salaries too, and they need to get back to work. Productivity is proven to be, you know, in decline when people work from home. So, you know, get the buggers back to work.
Tina, I love your common sense. I mean, how would you have the gall as one of those public servants to actually speak out publicly, let alone go to a tribunal, when what you're doing is sitting on your backside at home on a laptop while the people you're actually working with are out there doing one of the toughest jobs you can possibly have?
Oh, they should be ashamed of themselves, Steve, and just goes to show what a party they're having at home, that they're so desperate not to go back into the office. And what about the owners of these office buildings and the buildings that the government has leased to put these idiots in? Get them back to work. Tell them they have no choice. Get them back.
I'm sick and tired too of all this idea where we've got to change the name places of everything and tear down statues. I note that the Melbourne City Council, led by Sally Capp, the Lord Mayor, whose time has certainly run out, she needs to just step aside and let someone else do the job. They've decided to prioritise prominent women and Indigenous names while renaming streets and place names. Now, any proposal to name a street or a landmark that doesn't match the set of criteria would need to go back to council and be voted on. Prue, I mean, really? Are we going to start renaming streets now?
Well, you know, this is the woke capital of Australia, isn't it, Victoria? And all the Labor governments have this hidden agenda, Steve. Let's face it. Look, they didn't get the voice up, but they're going to do it anyway by subterfuge. This is all just part of the exercise to, you know, just, I think, you know, wallpaper the whole damn state and the whole of Australia with, you know, Indigenous everything. We're going to hear it and see it, I believe, all the way through, and this is just the thin edge of the wedge.
Steve, Jacinda Ardern did this in New Zealand, renamed everything, and no one knows where they are or where they're going. I was there, and it was nuts trying to find where I was supposed to be.
Yeah, people watching the weather at night can't work out what town they're talking about. Tina, you'll love this. For my sins, I turned up at IKEA in Richmond in Melbourne on Saturday morning last week. It opened at 10 o'clock, I think it was, and I was one of the first people through the door. What do you think I heard over the loudspeaker at the Richmond IKEA store at 10 o'clock last Saturday morning?
Well, we know. Welcome to country. Yes. Welcome to your own country, Steve.
In a Swedish furniture shop. I mean, really?
They should do something interesting and say it in the Swedish native language. Do it in German or something, just to spice it up a bit, Steve. I mean, it's past the point of no return. And Jacinda Price will be onto this when she's back from the conference she's in London. I tell you, she'll be onto this in a heartbeat.
Let's hope so.
Well, I think, we showed 60 to 40 that the whole issue of the Indigenous question went down. Just finally, Tina, what do you make of the fact Labor's going to keep forecasts of the NDIS cost secret? I mean, anyone who looks at NDIS knows it's just blown out completely.
You know what worries me, Steve? That 11% of boys between 5 and 7 are on the NDIS for some form of ADHD or autism. I think it's very sad that young boys are on that. They're trying to hide the real cost of the NDIS.
The fact that they can keep that secret is an absolute disgrace. Great to see you both as usual, Prue and Tina. Thank you very much for your time. Up next, the great Rita Panahi.